destructive impact of climate change. That is why mitigating existing risks, preventing new ones, and strengthening the nation's socio-economic and environmental resilience continue to be top priorities. This is reflected in the updated National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan, or NDRRMP, for 2020 to 2030. One of the key strategies of the plan is to use a science-based approach to risk assessment to improve disaster resilience and climate change adaptiveness. To achieve this, the NDRRMP 2020 to 2030 promotes the use of GeoRisk-PH for the latest, most accurate, and efficient risks and hazards assessment. GeoRisk-PH is a multi-agency initiative led by the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, or PHIVOLCS. Its goal is to be the country's main source of information for risk assessment and to help the government increase the nation's resilience to natural hazards. There are 3 platforms under GeoRisk-PH. Hazard Hunter PH, which shows initial seismic, volcanic, and hydrometeorological hazard assessments for specific locations. GeoAnalytics PH, which performs in-depth analysis and visualization of a locale's potential exposure to natural hazards. And GeoMapper PH, which collects hazard and exposure information to ensure that the database is accurate and timely. GeoRisk-PH is a tool that can aid our local government units in the conduct of climate and disaster risk assessment for hazard and risk-informed policymaking and planning, including the local DRRM plan. Through the use of the government's multi-hazard central database system, LGUs can have a more accurate and timely understanding of the hazards and risks within the community. This will help local governments reduce their community's vulnerability and ensure their people's safety. Let's continue working together in building safer, more adaptive, and disaster-resilient Filipino communities.
Thank you for joining us. So in this episode, we focus on Kwentong Kinabukasan, or stories of the future. Our guests will help us explore our climate futures and what it truly takes for Filipino communities to be climate resilient. I am your host, Tato Sarmiento, Communications Manager at the OML Center. Joining our conversation are Dr. Faye Cruz, Head of the Regional Climate Systems Laboratory at the Manila Observatory. Team DanTAOn, represented by architect Arlene Lusterio, is a group of communicators and development workers that intend to amplify the voices of the most vulnerable sectors in the country and place them at the forefront of climate dialogues. And Attorney Lesley Cordero, Asia 21 Fellow and Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist at the World Bank based in Singapore. Doc Faye, if you could please help us through the technicalities. What exactly are climate projections and what do we know about our potential climate futures?
Good morning and good day to all. Thank you very much again for the invitation to be here. I've been asked to explain what climate projections are. Here it is. Climate projections give us a picture, some idea of what the climate would look like in the future. For example, are we going to have more warm days, more warm nights? Will there be more rainy days or dry days? Are we going to experience more typhoons and so on? And to get these projections, scientists use climate models. Our understanding of the physical and dynamical processes in the climate system are expressed into these mathematical equations that are solved by climate models. Different types of information go into these models. For example, topography, land use, and other drivers of climate, including greenhouse gas concentrations. Examples of greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and water vapor. These gases come from different sources that could be from natural and human activities like industry, waste, energy, forests, agriculture, and transportation. It is these heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere that have been increasing in concentration and are now at the highest levels in at least 2 million years, which has caused global surface temperatures to have increased at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. Each of the past 4 decades have been the warmest on record, and the past 10 years from 2010 to 2019 is about 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than in 1850 to 1900. Climate projections are based on emission scenarios that come from socioeconomic scenarios that consider different factors, future developments, population trends, energy and land use, and so on, including whether we do nothing and continue business as usual or reduce or avoid greenhouse gas emissions. We have had different ways in creating these scenarios. A couple of years ago, we had what we called representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, but in the recent assessment report of the IPCC, the scenarios are now from the shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs. As we can see in this figure, the different scenarios result in different CO2 concentrations in the future, and we then use this information in the climate models to see how the climate responds to these future changes in greenhouse gas concentrations. In AR6, which is the latest IPCC report, a set of 5 illustrative emission scenarios are used to explore the impact of greenhouse gases, land use, and air pollutants on the global climate. In this figure showing the temperature change from pre-industrial times, we can expect to reach or exceed a 1.5 degree global warming level on average in the next 20 years. However, the temperature changes become different after this period, depending on future CO2 concentrations and emissions. It would still be possible to limit global warming levels below 1.6 degrees before declining to below 1.5 degrees by the end of the century under the very low CO2 emission scenario and below 2 degrees under the low CO2 emission scenario. To do so will require rapid reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, reaching net zero CO2 emissions around 2050, followed by net negative CO2 emissions. Aside from CO2, strong reductions in other greenhouse gas emissions such as methane are also needed to limit global warming, which would not only benefit the climate but also improve air quality. Reductions in greenhouse gas emissions can also slow down the rate of changes in the ocean, ice sheets, and sea level. Limiting global warming below 1.5 degrees will limit climate extremes from becoming more extreme. AR6 also highlights that every amount of warming matters. We will see greater changes in climate, including extreme heat, heavy rainfall, drought, sea level rise at 2 degrees compared to 1.5 degrees global warming in most regions, which would be even more widespread and or pronounced above 2 degrees of global warming. In Southeast Asia, temperatures will increase and extreme heat events will become more intense and more frequent. Rainfall will generally increase in northern parts of Southeast Asia, whereas summer rainfall is projected to decrease in areas in the maritime continent. Extreme precipitation and flooding will become more frequent and more intense. We expect also fewer tropical cyclones affecting Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, but the frequency of intense tropical cyclones will increase. According to DOST Pag-asa in their 2018 report, the Philippines has been warming at an average rate of 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade over the past 65 years from 1951 to 2015, with nighttime temperatures increasing at a faster rate at 0.15 degrees Celsius per decade. Future projections indicate that this warming will continue, ranging from 0.9 degrees to 2.3 degrees Celsius by mid-21st century, depending on whether it is a moderate or high emission scenario, and ranging from 1.3 to 4.1 degrees Celsius by the end of the 21st century. We see that the range of warming is lower under a moderate emission scenario, here shaded in blue. We expect a warmer future for the Philippines in this century, where the warming is higher in a high emission scenario. On the other hand, many parts of the country are projected to experience drier conditions on average, here shown in shades of brown, especially over Mindanao, except for Northwest Luzon, where rainfall may increase in the future. However, extreme rainfall events that can lead to flooding can still occur. In addition to climate change mitigation, it is also possible to lower risk and enhance resilience through the implementation of appropriate and integrated adaptation strategies that address multiple hazards and reduce exposure and vulnerability. Climate and Disaster Risk Assessments, or CIDRA, is a first step towards building resilient communities. Through CIDRA, communities can identify and understand the root causes of risk and the potential impacts at the local level, helping communities use climate projections to make evidence and science-based decisions on appropriate climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction strategies that can go into their local climate change action plans, comprehensive land use plans, and so on. Climate projections can be used as input to tools such as the Climate Information Risk Analysis Matrix developed by DOST Pag-asa and the more recent Climate Extremes Risk Analysis Matrix introduced in the Philippine Climate Extremes Report of DOST Pag-asa, Manila Observatory, and Ateneo de Manila University, which was funded by DOST PSURD, which can be used with other planning tools to integrate climate information for climate change adaptation and risk reduction. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Doc Faye, for the very thorough presentation. May babalikan lang ako dun sa presentation. So for clarification, when we talk about climate projections, for now, we really can't say where we're headed. What it provides us is oversimplifying. It's like Waze or Google Maps. It gives you an estimate of, depending on various factors, gaano kataas. So what range of warming are we looking at, all scenarios considered?
Well, depending on also on the time frame, the time period, and the scenario. So by mid-21st century, the range of temperatures that we're expecting would be from 0.9. It could be as high as 0.9 or as high as 2.3 degrees Celsius. So that depends on the scenario that we're looking at. And then by the end of the 21st century, it could be from 1.3 degrees Celsius to 4.1 degrees Celsius.
Thanks, Doc Faye. So I think that establishes that regardless of the scenarios, whether the most modest or the most drastic, we are definitely looking at increased warming. It's just a matter of how bad the warming will be. You also mentioned that there are available climate risk studies already and action on the ground in communities. Iba-iba kasi yung impact ng warming, increased
Yes.
rainfall in different communities. Are these climate risk studies that are publicly available, are they localized for the Philippines?
At the moment, what we have are projections that are about 25 by 25 kilometers. It's good for the provincial scale, and maybe also for areas that will be at that scale. But if you're concerned with barangays or municipalities, you might still need to do further downscaling. But that would mean that we will have to have more computing resources to do what we call the downscaling, to get the higher resolution information from these global climate projections. But what we have are, I think, good enough, but it can still be improved.
Thanks, Doc Faye. Thank you so much. So now we turn to our storyteller and advocate. Can you please introduce yourselves and the work that you are doing at the intersection of climate change and climate futures? Architect Arlene.
I'm representing the team DanTAOn. DanTAOn was originally coined because I'm with TAO Pilipinas, the NGO, and then we formed a group of volunteers. And the intention is to present graphically or to humanize, as Kappa was mentioning that earlier, climate data for the next 100 years. So we started in 2018 or 2020, so now it's 2022. The objective was to look at the impact of projections of the impact of climate change by 2100 in the Philippines, especially in sea level rise. So because you're an archipelagic country. So we started with a forum. We are part of the Umalahokan Fellows of OML, and the intention is to gather stories from communities. So we have partner communities in different places in the country. So we have conducted some interviews, and the intention was to translate these stories into graphic translations, as well as some narratives that we'll post, and then like geo-reference, and post them together on a base map, showing and correlate it with scientific data on sea level rise. So it's the original intention.
Attorney Lesley.
Hi again, everyone. I am Lesley Cordero, an Asia 21 Fellow, at the same time a Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist at the World Bank. So I used to handle the Philippine program alone, but now it's broadened to the region. So you're talking about Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Pacific countries also. And right now, what we're doing is looking at disaster risk management and how do you link it to climate change adaptation as well as mitigation. And the work that World Bank does is in the form of lending, knowledge or analytical work, reports, support to government at the national level, at the regional level, and also at the local level. And at the local level, we work closely with local government units as well as the communities, the barangays, and organizing communities, mobilizing them, working closely with civil society organizations, academia, private sector, as well as other development partners. And the focus is not just looking at lending. It's also highlighting how we can focus on three pillars. Number one is the physical resilience, policy, implementation, monitoring progress. We're also looking at financial resilience, looking at various innovative instruments and supporting not just the national level or central government, but how do you make sure that the support will flow also to the affected communities, to beneficiaries on the ground who are at the forefront in dealing with this climate risks and disasters. And lastly, we have highlighted that it's not just enough to do physical and financial resilience, social resilience. And this is where we can talk about how we can communicate more these climate risks, translate it in a language that the communities and the people on the ground would understand and take action. So in a nutshell, that's what we are doing. And on the advocacy side, doing a lot of these panel discussions and sessions, working with young people, and also hearing the views of other sectors and other perspectives from different partners.
Thank you. Welcome again, Doc Faye, Arlene, and Attorney Lesley. So, balikan kita, Architect Arlene. If you can tell us more about the campaign and the communities that you focused on, and actually, why did you select these communities for your stories?
We have targeted several sites, one from all over the Philippines. So, but mostly Visayas and Mindanao, no, because these are there, and also some in Luzon. One is in Zamboanga, because it's a partner. There's a partnership with one of the members of DanTAOn team, no, Morton Cinco, and then we worked in G1, Eastern Samar, the first landfall of Yolanda. So we selected some, it's in 2 islands, Nakumanhon and Manicani. And then we do have partners in Montalbano, in Rodriguez Rizal, and we know that this area is a flood basin, and yet it's the biggest settlement site. So we know that there are so many major disasters, no, after some typhoons, no, happen there. So we've selected the sites, and then we also partner with a group, with a community along the Laguna Lake, so Lakeshore. So these are the areas that we plan to gather information, gather stories, and we've done some interviews. So with Zamboanga, with Manicani, and then in Montalban, as well as in Paarenda. Paarenda is one of the biggest informal settlement in Southern Metro Manila. It's in Taytay, Rizal. It's 96 hectares, so you can imagine. So very high density. And so we've done this so far. We gathered some pictures as well, and then what we do is we plan to correlate, no, their stories with the data, no, scientific data, so they could connect, no, what's happening to them, and then what does the scientific data is saying. So we are at this stage, no, we haven't done significantly in translating these stories, and maybe maybe I could share some of the slides just so people will understand better, no, how we plan to translate those stories. No? So, for example, so this is just the logo, and maybe this is what you will see when you enter the platform. So we have this platform, some teasers, because what happens is when there's a major disaster, the stories are heard, no? When there's a major disaster, but there are also small events happening in many communities that are not documented and are not known, no? And yet it's happening. And it's important also to listen to these voices, no? and to share it with the world, and also to justify or to show to the world, no, that this is what's happening to a small country like the Philippines, and this is what climate change is doing to us, and this is not our fault. Especially. Yeah, so this is one graphic translation of an island. I think this is part of Manicani Island. You can see before, no, the island, what's visible, no? And then say after 100 years, what could happen? No? So significantly, because of sea level rise, malaki talaga yung mawawala. And yet people don't know about this, because what's 100 years? No? We are more concerned about the present. And it's so difficult for them to understand what could happen to them in the far future. But with this translations, then it brings to the consciousness of the people, especially those people in those sites, no, who will be affected. What could possibly happen? It could make them start thinking, no, and be more aware, no, and also correlate, no, the current happening, no, that the current events that they're experiencing with what's the projection, whether there's some truth in it. maybe as an example, very concretely ngayon, no, what I saw, like we hear in the news that Mandawi is flooded, no, Cagayan is flooded. How does these are real stories on the ground, no? And how does these stories correlate with scientific data, no? Yung projections halimbawa na present ni Doc Faye, no? Makukuha ba natin yung correlation? Because it's important also to support it, no, with scientific data. Hindi to chismis, dito marites, no? Na these are data supported, no? So it's something that you cannot just negate, no? Or just say na it might not happen kasi malayo pa, no? And especially people don't believe it if they don't feel it, no? We always learn from experience. If you don't experience it, ang tagal natin matuto. So, and as I said earlier in our talk, it's important to see projections. So this is actually projections, no? But it's also important to look at impacts, no? Like what are they experiencing now, no? And how does that correlate to the science, no? To what science is saying. And because impacts are more concrete and experienced by the people. So maybe it's a little bit of a shift in the plan of DanTAOn, that initially we wanted to really show projections of 100 years in the different areas, actually looking at using climate central data. You know? So there are several areas in the Philippines where sea level rise is very, very significant. It will impact a big number of a bigger population. So initially that's the target, no? To look at those areas, and really based on projections. But now I think it's we are also considering looking at impacts, no? Para mas nakaka-relate yung mga tao. And the campaign really is to gather volunteers who are willing to help us in this, no? Either translating, making graphic translation, accessing open source maps. Now of course, this is not, we're not as rich as World Bank. No, we don't have that much funding. So, and also volunteers to write stories, no? To document stories on the ground and share it with us. No? So they can reach us through our Facebook account. We have a Facebook page, and then maybe they could communicate and then we could help out. No?
Arlene, baka we can go through some of these slides para there are examples of the kinds of visualization that you mentioned.
Yeah, maybe there's another one.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so I think this one is Manikani, right here, the whole island. So you see how much is lost. And this is based on Climate Central sea level rise data.
I think there are a few more slides, yeah.
Yeah. So this is also Manikani Island. And it's current, no? And this is the platform. So it's the site which they could search. And it's actually, we plan also to present data in various languages or dialects so people could directly connect to it. No? So it's not just English. So these are just some of the sites that we have already gathered some data. Initially, the plan is if you tick on those red marks, then the information about those sites will come out. And yeah, is there another one?
Yeah.
So just some images, and also another translation is something like this, no? And it doesn't have to be a long story. It can be like a paragraph about their aspirations, about the current situation, or what they're going through. Yeah.
Thank you, Arlene. I think you explained thoroughly why it's important to try and visualize what 100 years of impact could mean. But working with communities, from your experience, are these communities concerned about future climate? What does it mean to them?
Actually, they're aware about climate change. Like maybe they say the word climate change, but what does that really mean to them? abstract siya, no? It's so abstract that and I'm sure they cannot project what's gonna happen to them 100 years from now. Take for example Manila Bay with the many controversial projects planned there, no, na reclamation projects, and then the projection of sea level rise could reach up to Pabuhay, no, Welcome Rotonda. So imagine the area that will be covered. What will happen to Manila 100 years from now when that area is underwater? Even I cannot imagine it.
But what I like about your project is you're trying, I mean, Doc Faye mentioned, there's a standard for what the projections are, but how it will actually impact certain communities, iba-iba yung magiging scenarios. There are areas that will experience more rainfall. There are areas that will experience less. The general Filipino public is very aware of the impacts of climate change, although they may not necessarily call it climate change. For everyone in the panel, do you think storytelling and visualization have a place in trying to capture people's interests and trying to enable action on their climate risks?
Definitely, yes. Storytelling, making sure the narrative is out there, communicating it in a language that could be understood by the people is very important. And we have learned that lesson both from the World Bank side, when you have all these reports, what Doc Faye presented, people would not be able to grasp what climate change is. When I was back in government in 2010 to 2015, at the height of Typhoon Yolanda, even if you tell them that there will be a storm surge, president going out, doing a public service announcement, cutting all programming, people knew that it's something that's scary, but they don't know what it means. So we need to do a better job in helping them imagine what the climate risks, what these scenarios or projections would look like vis-a-vis the impact of something that they have experienced. So we could have said that similar to what happened in Japan, a tsunami-like event. Or we can also talk about the flooding that Arlene mentioned. Imagine what Metro Manila looked like back in 2009 when we were hit by tropical storm Ondoy. And then they can start feeling that and evoke that feeling of, we don't want that to happen to us. Ayaw kong ma-stuck dun sa EDSA kasi ang taas na ng tubig. So how can we tell those stories as a reminder? And what we have learned is that the Typhoon Yolanda, lessons as well as stories, the narrative of people in Tacloban, in people in Ground Zero, they were very powerful. So 8 years after, 9 years after, when we start talking about we need to plan better, we need to make sure that our communities are more resilient, our local government units are more prepared, because what happened in Tacloban, we don't want that to happen in our LGUs. Then they start acting, then they start worrying and take it seriously. So for practitioners like us, technical topics, climate risk, climate information, all these projections, we need to translate it into something that could be understood, something that's interesting, fun, and short.
Short talaga. Doc Faye, kaya ba yon from translating climate data into visuals and stories in a short way? From your experience.
It's certainly a challenge, but it's a challenge that we can meet. And it could be done through collaboration with communicators, with adaptation practitioners, people on the ground. So I do agree that storytelling plays an important role in communicating climate risk, because people need to also understand what they are at risk to in particular, so that they can develop the strategies that will meet those risks that they are, to have this proper context of how they will address the future climate changes that they will face. It's not really the problem, as you mentioned, is that climate change will affect us in different ways, and therefore it helps to understand, what are the potential ways in which, these impacts, this climate changes will translate to. What are the possible impacts? Whether that means, are we getting more extreme rainfall in the future, or more consecutive rainfall days? So that can be. We need to be prepared for these particular flood heights, and how we design and take that into consideration in how we design our houses or our buildings. And so, yes, it also helps, I think, to if we cannot, as Attorney Lesley mentioned, if we cannot we are not able to help them imagine the future, then maybe we can also look back into the past. So look back into particular extreme events that have happened in their locality, so that they have an understanding of what does it mean to have an extreme rainfall event. It's also helpful to go back into the recent past, so that we have some memory wherein we can understand, and we can explain the projections into something that we can understand, something we can relate to. And I do understand that these concepts tend to be abstract, and storytelling can, in ways in which people will relate to and understand, can help them be more. It would be more relatable and more relevant.
Agreeing. I mean, it's hard enough for people to even visualize, tell them, the shore will recede by 500 meters. What does that look like? Or the water will rise by how many millimeters? Who measures millimeters on a day-to-day basis? But what the three of you are actually telling me is some of the communities that have already been hit by extreme events have already experienced of these events. They learn from it because there's a visual memory of it. And the challenge now is those communities na hindi pa, pero may potential na ma-hit ng extreme events na yon. The visualization will help them avoid actually experiencing it. Tama ba? So, yes, Lesley.
Tama. And I think as you have mentioned, aside from the communities, I'll digress a bit. Your storytelling, the narrative, the simplifying some of these very complex and up there scenarios, projections, the reports, the studies, is also, I think, important for policymakers and decision makers, because it's not just the communities that we want action from, right? And the challenge is sometimes our policymakers, decision makers, has very short attention span. So that's also a very good way to also tell the story. But going back to your question, I think the most powerful storytellers are not the scientists, are not the specialists or experts or professionals. They are the community members, the people who were affected. And we have tested this when we were trying to pilot a training program to encourage local governments to prepare recovery plans and rehabilitation plans even before a disaster happens. So, di ba, mahirap yung sabihin mo sa kanila na kailangan natin mag-prepare because ang dami pa nilang kailangan gawin. And what we found very helpful was that when we had people who were affected by Typhoon Yolanda raising their hands and saying, if I will prepare now, I will have a better chance that I will get funding the moment a disaster hits, the moment the next major typhoon or earthquake lands, because I am ready. And we also heard this from local chief executives, mayors who were affected by Typhoon Ulysses, Rolly, and Quinta, the more recent ones. And we also had people who were affected by the pandemic. And now, when they tell the story, it's not just about one large-scale disaster. They were also talking about how to prepare for compounding shocks. And climate change was not even in that picture yet. So how do you bring in these compounding shocks plus these climate risks that they need to prepare for, slow onset disasters that they also need to plan for? So I think the most powerful storytellers to convince the people who are not yet affected are the ones who have experienced it.
Agreeing. Since you raised policy, I guess it's also that experience, that lived experience, that also kind of help determines which communities are more resilient now. The learnings from Yolanda, some of the communities in Leyte have already learned from it. Bicol area has had a lot of experience with tropical cyclones. So napaka-prepared nila for extreme events. But what we're finding now with tropical cyclone paths shifting, as prepared as Bicol is, hindi na sila yung masyadong tinatamaan. So there needs to be a knowledge transfer. And what I'm hearing here is the knowledge transfer is not just in the science, it's also in the stories so that the community members and policymakers can learn from it. Arlene, is this making sense in terms of the communities you've worked with?
Yeah, very much. No, as I earlier said, people learn from experience. So theory, kasi ang theory hindi talaga ganun ka. It doesn't move people no, to action. But experience, malaking bagay. No? And the sharing from different groups, no? It's important to bring together no, people who's experienced the disasters or impacts, no? And for others to listen, although they've already, most of them have heard this in the news, but it's also different to hear it directly from the people who went through, you know, the difficulties, the challenges due to a hazard, the impact of a hazard. So, ibang dimension, no? yung ganon. And not only the struggles, but the recovery, no? How they recovered, what they did, and then something that others should not, maybe mistakes that others should not repeat again, no? Because we say history repeats itself. Yes, it's really like that. Maybe because we lack the communication. So malaking bagay yung na i-communicate, because if the story stays in that locality, then yeah, nothing happens. No? So it's really important to communicate the stories, whether it's an oral history or it's a written history or it's through graphics, no? Actual images of what happened and how they recovered, or artistic translations of such also is also important.
And yes, Dr.
No, you might want to follow up on that. Okay, no, I just wanted to echo what Attorney Lesley said about the importance of local knowledge, and also you mentioned about Albay and their experience. So another area where they're very experienced, for example, with typhoons is Batanes. So they've already built their houses in response to they know that they are. They experience tropical cyclones, every year. And so they built their houses and their communities, they know what to do if there's an incoming typhoon. So it also helps to listen to their experience, to their knowledge, and see, the sharing of best practices. But it's also important to know that what works for them might not necessarily work for other communities. So it's good to have an idea of what the others are doing, but to also see what their local context is. Because, for example, there might be some things that they're doing that will not work for them, or they might work on other aspects in their planning. So it's still important to understand their own local context and to plan accordingly to whatever future climate change impacts they would face.
Yes, Arlene.
Yeah, I just want to add also, as mentioned by Attorney Lesley, role of the local government unit. Go back to the local climate change action plan. It's very important. We also consider this now in the DanTAOn platform to feature local government models, model local governments who has formulated and really implemented effective LCCAP, no? Because if you look at most LCCAPs, focus pa rin niya yung DRR, no? Not really climate change. So it's also a challenge, no? And the LGU has a big role also to influence how people behave, no, in the locality. If they pass policies or regulations, no, sometimes there's a need to really not necessarily force, but maybe strongly influence people, no, to really take heed of the, especially locational hazards, no, exposure. No, it's the biggest challenge. No, how to move people out of the coastal areas, especially their connection to livelihood. But so yeah, it's really important to look at also how the government, no, sees the problem and find solutions to that. No, not as simple as moving people out, but as Attorney Lesley was saying, we also need to look at social, no, the social aspect. No? It's not enough to just address it physically. Dapat holistic pa rin yung approach. Yeah.
Oo. So bumabalik tayo dun sa importante pa rin. Stories are very useful and helpful in terms of planning the future and preparing for scenarios. Pero importante pa rin na naka-angkla dun sa understanding what is your precise climate risks and impacts. Nabanggit ni Doc Faye that not all data available can be scaled down to the barangay level. But even within the pandemic, you know how one barangay is impacted, kahit tawid lang ng kalye, iba na dun sa kabilang barangay. And I also like Doc Faye mentioning that we also have to be cautious about best practices because it might not be appropriate for your area if you don't understand your climate risks. Dito po pasok yung maladaptation. We've had a lot of reports where when flooding is a problem, the automatic solution is taasan ng kalye, which might not be appropriate for the area. So these are great inputs. So babalik ko lang dun sa understanding climate risks and climate scenarios, and you've raised it already, how local governments and policymakers play a role. How can they look at scenarios and help their communities? Yes, the data can be daunting, but the climate scenarios that we have, how can that be translated into something that's useful to communities? Do you have ideas?
It has always been a struggle, grappling with how do we translate these things, right? And how do we make this interesting so that people pay attention? What we're doing right now is in the bank, we are supporting the Department of Science and Technology in their GeoRisk PH platform. It's an integrated platform where all the hazards are already layered. But one challenge right now is the climate extremes, the climate risk information are not yet integrated. So the UST is trying to work closely with PAG-ASA and the other people in the academia and institutions focus on this to slowly integrate some of these information and overlay some of these information in their platform. What World Bank is doing right now is the platform is there. How do we train local government units who will be preparing their local climate change action plans, local DRRM plans, land use plans, and all the other frameworks that they need to prepare using this multi-hazard risk information. And we all know that access is also difficult. So one key thing that we need to talk about is how do we translate some of these projections, scenarios, information into something and data that is accessible. The second step. Third step is how can we make these data sets useful and integral as they prepare their plans, as they try to imagine, sinabi ni Doc Faye, how do they imagine part of the climate and disaster imagination of what the impacts are so that they can plan better. They can propose better programs, projects, and activities. And then the next phase is to also find funding to be able to implement some of these plans, diba? And then ang fourth layer is paano natin i-involve yung communities yung other people na wala sa government. Kasi hindi naman kaya ng government alone. So is there a way or a mechanism for community involvement and contribution so that everyone has a stake in doing this? So we have come up together with the OST, Office of Civil Defense, the Disaster Council, and Department of Interior and Local Government na etong mga information na to gawin nating web-based online tool using technology. How can we do it faster? How can we make this more accessible to people and simplified? So nag-launch tayo ng Plan Smart, Ready to Rebuild. It's a web-based tool that local governments can use, partners in the academy, private sector, everyone can access. So itatype mo lang, ano yung area mo, ano yung province, city, or municipality, automatic nalalabas yung layered or na-overlay na mga hazards and risks in your area. So ang appeal ko is how can we bring this climate projection scenarios plus itong mga climate extremes na Pag-asa has into the fold so that it will be easier for LGUs and communities to prepare. Kasi mahihirapan sila kung paisa-isa nilang titingnan, di ba? Pupunta sila sa MGB, pupunta sila sa NAMRIA, but here it's already there. And then to encourage more people, like from Arlene's organization, from OML, other private sector partners who help fund the initiative para hindi na natin i-duplicate yung mga tools, yung planning process. Instead, we will have more local governments, more people in the barangay or communities participate. Kasi yun yung kulang, yung training program para maka-access sila dun sa facility na yan, and they can work in preparing their local climate action plans as well as DRM plans. So it's also an appeal to everyone who's doing this to support government in their Plan Smart, Ready to Rebuild, pwede rin Plan Smart, Local Climate Action Planning, pwedeng ma-customize itong program na to.
You raise a good point, Attorney Lesley, na yes, we have access to all of these scenarios and data, but right now, parang they're seen in silos. Separate disaster risk plan, separate LCCAP. And I think this is where stories can help. Kasi stories can contain and visualize a complexity of considerations, no? Arlene, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I think in maybe another layer to the what World Bank is doing or planning is we do have the participatory mapping, diba? So which people can do, and which could also be initiated by the local government, go down to the barangay, to the purok, or normally if it's outside Metro Manila, wala namang people's organizations. No, normally it's with the barangay. So maybe it's like gathering data in a similar manner as the CBMS. No? The CBMS, see that CBMS data is really coming from the barangay level. Now, maybe if you could do climate or hazards, not data, but hazards and climate impacts at that level, then that addresses the problem that Dr. Faye was saying na it's masyadong broad, no? Hindi kaya yung by 25 by 25 kilometer resolution. It's like ground truthing already, no? The data that you have. It's good to have the context, no? That you put all the layers in maybe one platform, but still there are many information on the ground that is not really included in the big picture. No? So I think if it's possible to facilitate a participatory process of mapping hazards at the level of the barangay or the community, kung meron ka, that's something.
If I may add to what Architect Arlene said and to what Attorney Lesley said. So yeah, I also would like to add that in our experience, we've also seen that it's also a good thing to have a partnership between academe and the local governments. And they could also be partnerships with CSO, private sectors, and because I understand that it can be very daunting also for policymakers to understand everything. So it's good to have a partner to help in this process of understanding the climate scenarios, what are the impacts, what are the possible adaptation options, and their responses, how they can craft their plans. So it really takes a whole of society effort, to address this problem, to address this issue.
Thank you. Ang daming ang complexities if we really want action on the ground and for data to really move from just being data to an action that inspires community resilience. And dito rin babalik na yes, maraming integration that needs to happen to the data. There's a lot of anchoring in terms of the long-term planning. But there's also a need to kind of bridge the storytellers and the influencers, the marites of the community. So it becomes kind of like there's a top-down approach, but there's also a ground-up participatory approach that is taken into consideration. From your experience, are there issues or stories related to climate projections, scenarios, or futures that you think are being overlooked or underreported?
Generally, when we're doing all these trainings, always from the lens right now of climate adaptation and disaster resilience, because it's something that's tangible for them. But when we are doing the training, what we did was we have a built-in communications plan and strategy so that those who participated in the training will get to hear their stories. So the impact story, I think it's a good practice because sometimes most of the projects would not spare a budget, right? For preparing a video, for preparing this infographics. And what we realize is that it's more powerful to hear how the training has impacted the lives of people who went through it. And you can hear the testimonies of the mayors, their planning officers. And when you ask them why they're doing this, their response would be because we want to be more prepared, and not just for response, not just for rehabilitation and recovery, but also to look at prevention and mitigation, risk reduction. And then they start mentioning climate change. They wanna prepare because they know that there's climate change, but it stops there. So ano sa climate change, di ba? Because it's very broad. So I think maybe we can try to find innovative ways of communicating and helping them zero in on certain things so that they can narrow down their narratives also. Because these are powerful narratives. And then you can hear also, because of the pandemic, that people are talking about it more and preparing for it more. And nakakataba ng puso to hear them say that kasi po, na-experience namin yung COVID-19, tinamaan kami ng bagyo, tapos alam namin na because of climate change, may marami pang dadating. So we need to prepare better. And then another satisfying, gratifying stories that this practitioners on the ground, local planners are saying is that importante po yung information, yung data. And part ng process of this GeoRisk platform and Plan Smart program is yung data pool for local government units, yung sinasabi ni Arlene, na mag-share din sila ng information and ilalagay nila sa system para yung granularity of the data and information that the national government platform has would be improved. Hindi perfect, hindi mo rin ma-force lahat ng LGUs, pero slowly because they see the value of getting access also to these maps and information, then they're willing to share. And yun, maganda yun because before, pahirapan. So I think slowly when they can hear local government units, other people in the planning offices, share na important, may takeaway sila, then I think we can encourage and influence more people to join.
Yes, Arlene.
Yeah, maybe another addition, focus on, and maybe I'm just worried about most local governments would propose like structural measures normally. So it will have an impact on how you respond, no? And we're talking of adaptation. So siguro it's also important to hear more stories about adaptation, and maybe to also impact on women. So parang yun, siguro some focus on these actors and some solutions, and also to maybe promote nature-based solutions. No? Kasi adaptation, but if we do structural measures, it fails up to a certain, or it will work up to a certain point. No? And when it fails, it fails. No? So we need nature-based solutions, and yet this is not yet so well understood also. No? Another big word na naman siya. No? So yun. But maybe if there are models and examples, then that serves as a good reference point, no? for others to learn from, and hopefully with a more open mind, no? to learn and to really come up with real solutions on the ground. Yeah.
If I may add, okay, I was thinking like it's also important that there is that relationship between, I mean, all the actors involved in this process. Like, for example, in the science, it's always changing. It's always there are always advances, and as I mentioned previously, we had these representative concentration pathways, and now it's like shared socioeconomic pathways. So there are different assumptions that as we continue to learn, we understand more. We try to improve these models, to improve these projections, and so it's important that we're able to communicate to everyone who is using this information. What are the updates? How is that relevant to me? And so it's I think what's key also is to have that iteration, that communication, working together between the scientists, the impacts and adaptation community, the practitioners, and the decision makers, that they're all, and the communities, and that they all understand, what is the latest information. And I was also add, I was thinking that we've had experiences, for example, of Typhoon Haiyan, and so Tacloban would be now incorporating that knowledge or that experience into their plans. So it would be interesting to also, if we could revisit, if, for example, another Haiyan type of typhoon will affect this community, are they resilient? Are they already ready to face that challenge? So perhaps it is also good to have projects that revisit and monitor how are we progressing in these plans, and
Na-trigger ako kay Doc Faye because nagkwentuhan kami ni Kato earlier, and we all thought that the Filipinos are more resilient, the communities are more resilient because we have learned our lesson from that super typhoon Haiyan back in 2013. And we're saying that it's a 1 in 30, event. And 8 years after December 2021, we were struck by Typhoon Odette. And in terms of impact, in terms of the number of local governments that are affected, regions, you're seeing Caraga, you're seeing Surigao del Norte, Dinagat Island, you saw Region 8, Region 7, Region 6 affected. And it's heartbreaking to know that the things that we were prepared for, supposed to be, the playbooks that we have prepared, went out the window. And a few months after, people who are in the affected areas are still struggling because they don't have their houses rebuilt, livelihoods restored. And the question is, what happened to all the lessons we have learned from previous disasters? And it didn't help that it was also a compounded shock of the pandemic and a few other flooding and the other super typhoon that struck back in December. So I think we have a comparative analysis to look at now, 8 years after. In 2017, the World Bank came up with a study, an assessment of the short and medium term efforts of Typhoon Yolanda. This is government. What are the lessons learned and how have they captured and institutionalized some of these lessons? Now, I'm doing another assessment of Typhoon Odette response and rehabilitation effort. So we'll see what will come out of it. we'll be as candid as we can, working closely with our government counterparts as well as the other stakeholders on the ground. We will be happy to share.
Habang nag-uusap tayo, parang nanganganak yung the kinds of stories that we should be having. In saying monitoring and evaluation, naalala ko yung mga Lola Basyang books from long ago and our mythology books, which are taught to children repeatedly for them to learn the lessons. And maybe we need something like that na for preparing for disasters and climate risks. At the same time, in relation to monitoring and evaluation, you're right. Most of the stories that are told, especially in media, when it comes to disasters, are very event-based. Ito yung nangyari, ito yung nag-donate si ganito, ito yung recovery. But once all of that dies down, when the cycle of life returns to normal, we don't really get to see a lot of stories of how the communities are faring, how are they slowly standing up, except maybe once a year, anniversary of Andoy, anniversary of Odette. And we need to hear more of that, maybe in solutions journalism, or just to be able to find out how the communities are faring. Maybe structurally, the infrastructure is back, but are the people mentally already prepared to move on also? And shifting gears lang, and speaking of moving on, Arlene, it's been nearly a year since you started your campaign, and you mentioned that there have been a lot of challenges. Can you talk more about the challenges in terms of storytelling and visualization? Because you have a great concept, trying to chronicle the current climate stories of different communities in the Philippines and trying to project what it could be in 100 years. What's slowing you down and what's keeping you hampered?
Yeah, maybe first we need warm bodies to do the work. Now we need warm bodies to do the work. The data is there, but we need to process the data. We have the platform, no? And I think some information are also changing. No? From the time we have documented them, no, we have gathered the information. So maybe there's also need to update some information that we have gathered. And just so happened that honestly we were not able to move forward. No, after the end of the fellowship, some of us were also very much involved with Odette. No, so things happened. Of course, the pandemic. No, we cannot meet face to face, although things can also be done online. Yeah. Yes, basically, yeah, we need warm bodies, and also we need warm bodies who are in the same wavelength. So like if we get volunteers, we wanted them to be also in sync with what we are doing. So maybe we can invite them to some processes that the partners are conducting, like consultations or orientation about different topics under big umbrella of climate change. Yeah.
So actually, you need more storytellers and communicators.
Yes.
And
Yes.
as Doc Faye and Attorney Lesley mentioned, when we talk about stories, actually maraming layers of stories. So regardless of what your expertise might be, you can actually contribute to growing these stories that help in community resilience. You don't have to be a journalism grad to be able to do that. You don't have to be a development worker to be able to contribute. So would you know, Arlene, the initial communities that you took a look at after a year, how are they doing?
For example, in Manicania, I know there are major changes because I don't know if I have to say it here. It used to be a mining exploration site. It was stopped during the time of Ms. Gina Lopez. But now I think they are back to to mining. So it's an issue and it's a big problem. And of course, it will impact the environment and the focus of people, because of course they have to fight against this issue. At the same time, they have to face the problems of climate change that's currently impacting their island, their small island. Other areas, for example, in Montalban, we interviewed after Typhoon Ulysses. So it's like most of the people were like reminiscing about Ondoy, and what they experienced and saying it's about the same, but they've learned their lesson from Ondoy. So many of them were like helping each other. And with the pandemic pa, sabay ng pandemic. So you have typhoon, disaster, and then you are going through pandemic. So response is a different way of responding dahil hindi pwedeng tapos there's hunger, many people don't have jobs because of the pandemic, so how do they survive, and we see like the concept of community pantry replicated in many areas within Montalban, like the small community organizations helping their own members and also raising funds or sharing whatever resources they have from within their, from their pockets, just like that. Yeah. So, it's a different disaster, the pandemic. But even if, because Ulysses also hit them hard. There were like areas in Montalban that were badly damaged, like some houses were toppled down also because of that, and they are not very much covered by the media. So there's some media cap there, so people don't know, or the public don't know. So so that's another story that we still have to write. So we have like images of those, in I think in Zamboanga, I'm not very much involved because this is the area by of Amor, but I don't know if she's but it's more positive, because they have I think climate resilient agriculture. That's the thing they're doing there, because they are in the Salug Valley, so it's like they're bound to be also flooded because it's a valley, and so people are more receptive to like talk about the issue of climate change and how they could act, be more responsive to the impacts of especially typhoons and flooding and where else. So far, those are the three major areas that they have documented. But there are more coming. Maybe if you have more volunteers. I didn't mention, of course, this is volunteer work and we don't have resources. So you say what's stopping us? If you have funds coming our way, then maybe it could help us as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Arlene. My next question is, I'd like Doc Faye to answer first, but it's open to all. So ang daming ang factors to consider. Recently, the World Risk Index ranked the Philippines as the most vulnerable country in the world. Given the scenario projections, given where we are, is there a possibility of a positive future for Filipino communities? Is it possible for us to move from the poster child of vulnerability to actually a guidepost for adaptation and resilience?
So yes, so recently we see that the Philippines has been ranked highest at risk to disasters, and this is because of our high exposure to multiple hazards, and our high vulnerability, our high exposure to multiple hazards compounded by our high vulnerabilities and also lack of adaptive and coping capacities. But we can also see from that list countries that have also even higher exposures to the hazards, like China, Mexico, Japan, but they are ranked lower they have lower risk than the Philippines because they have low vulnerabilities, or they have good adaptive and coping capacities. So I think that's a good indication that we can, even if we are exposed to these multiple hazards, we can still reduce our risk if we reduce our vulnerabilities through adaptation and resilience.
What say you, Architect Arlene and Attorney Lesley? Do you think, given the work that you do, you work with communities, you know the problems through the years, is there a possibility of a positive future?
I'll start. Very optimistic. As long as we also highlight the narratives and the stories of good practices, because mostly nada-downplay natin. And again, media, di ba? If there is a major disaster, it's always sexy to just talk about response, number of casualties, things like that. But when there are other parang longer development concerns during rehab and recovery, or positive stories during early recovery or response, hindi natin masyadong naha-highlight. So I think we can be a poster child by also shifting the narrative and talking about the good practices that we have. That's one side of the story. The other side, as what Doc Faye mentioned, is that we need to do a better job kasi nag-evolve na rin yung mga risks, di ba? Pero naiwan tayo sa Climate Change Act of 2009 na mga provisions. Parang nagsa-start pa tayong tapusin yung lahat ng mga local climate change action plans sa LGUs, di ba? 11 years after. Same with the Disaster Act. So maybe it's high time for us to also revisit some of our existing policies and laws, because the main question right now, with the science quickly evolving, are our mechanisms to cope also evolving with it quickly? Kasi ayaw natin maiwan. And then the other aspect also that we want to highlight is that we need to also revise the way we measure progress. Kasi as mentioned by Doc Faye, di ba? And Kato, na number one na tayo in terms of the World Risk Index. And ang interventions natin usually multi-agency, multi-sectoral. So can we do shared indicators, shared outcomes that will be measured towards resilience, and resilience for climate and disasters also? And wala pa yun sa mindset ng government agencies natin, ng local governments natin, or even ng mga partners who are operating in this space. So I think the next meeting of the Disaster Council should be talking about how can they develop a shared indicator to be able to measure and make sure that from being number one, we can now slowly go down that parang ranking. So hopefully, let's see how we can also support government in this approach.
Arlene, do you want to add to that?
I agree, no, but if count say target na lang tayo 2030. 2030. So in 8 years time, no, I'm pessimistic. No? I think it's a tall order to bring together all the agencies under one and have a unified, for example, no, set of indicators. Though we know that ideally, no, this is how sana it should be, and then maybe it'll help, no, more effective. But say working on the ground, parang ang layo pa, no? Parang hindi talaga siya nararamdaman ng mga tao, except those who went through already major disasters. So the learning for others who are just watching, no, from afar and waiting for a disaster to happen to them, medyo slow, no? So in that context, I would say I'm very pessimistic. In 8 years' time, we will change that image, no? And considering the degree of poverty that we have now, and if you look at the plans of government, which many are counter to climate resilient, response. It's a big question kung mangyayari. Maybe one thing positive is we have the awareness na we need to do this, but whether the will is there, no, political will is there, and how many, malaking role kasi ang local government, no, dahil sila yung nandoon, no. So how many among those, kahit na lang doon sa most vulnerable, no, local regions identified recently, no, parang merong ilan, 20 or 22 regions identified, no, among them, no, sino yung who has the political will, no, to shine and to really do the right thing, no. It's still a big question. Ibig sabihin, marami pang tatrabahuin at pupuyatin para mangyari yun. And the influence must come from those empowered, no. So for CSOs, halimbawa, we are not that powerful, no, to influence. It still remains with the local government unit, the national government agencies, and maybe like donor organizations like World Bank, you know. So, no, yeah. I mean, science can, like, MO is doing their role, no, in sharing the science, but depending if it falls on deaf ears or it's being taken seriously. And maybe we also need to look at the distribution of resources to local government units who are affected. No? Kasi kung even if you have the political will, but you don't have the resources because you're a third or fourth or fifth class municipality, how do you deal with that problem?
Thanks, Arlene. Okay lang naman din maging pessimistic. Because as we said, there are so many factors. And di ba, even in disaster preparedness, parang it's a good rule of thumb to try and prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And that's part of the importance of storytelling and preparing for our climate futures. We're not saying that we're hoping we don't reach 2.5 degrees increase, but we do have to try and prepare for that. Going
Sorry.
into my yes, okay.
May I add? Sorry. So I just wanted to mention that the Manila Observatory is working with agencies like and groups like the National Resilience Council. So this National Resilience Council brings together academe, the governments, the private sector, and they work with local governments following this resilience framework. So in this framework, they identified to target leadership and governance in resiliency and come up with indicators that look at the different aspects of human development, local economy, infrastructure, and environment as outcomes. So there's already like existing also, I mean, there are efforts in bringing together these different groups and coming up with indicators so that, you know, local governments can work on their resilience planning.
Thanks, Doc Faye. It really is sounding like from our discussion, it takes a barangay. It takes everyone to work on, to be doing their work and playing their part to be able to look at long-term community resilience. So I think in our discussions, we've kind of established what the challenge is and where we are. Ano yung kailangang all of the intricate dance in between to get us to where we should be. Going into my last question, given our current vulnerability and possible climate futures, what is the dream that you have for our vulnerable communities and their governance? What is true long-term community resilience in the midst of climate change? Baka we can start with Lesley.
The dream is to have communities that will no longer need the World Bank, will no longer need civil society organizations or private sector to support them. They will need local governments, they will need national government, but on their own, they have that coping mechanism and they have institutionalized some governance mechanism to be able to cope with changing climate and disaster risks. And I think aside from being resilient themselves, the ability to work with other communities, to mentor, to coach, to partner with other communities who are not yet that resilient. So I think that's the dream. And for communities to be able to have a platform and a voice to share their stories so that they could encourage others to do the same, as well as to highlight the resilience of the Filipinos, not just in the Philippines, but also at the regional and global level. Because we have a lot of good stories of resilient communities, but we need to amplify their voices so that others would follow.
Doc Faye, Arlene?
Sige. My climate dream is for communities to, and also future generations, to live well, and to have a safe, to live in a safe community, and that decision makers and policymakers would take note of the science. The science is available, but we have to work together so that they would understand, of course, what are the possible futures and how to be able to better prepare for those futures. We have the knowledge and the technology, so to make better use of that to respond to the issue of climate change. And yeah, so as just to follow also, we need for communities to work together, because climate change doesn't affect just one community or recognize political boundaries. So we really have to work together in adapting to these future changes.
Yeah, I speak for DanTAOn. The platform was born primarily to give voices to the stories of communities. And maybe the dream is for these voices to be heard not only in the Philippines, but globally, and to gather more voices, to be able to make a louder cry, to tell the world about what's happening in the Philippines because of climate change, because of what they're doing. And we know that problems will always be there. They'll never disappear. So I think another dream maybe is to have this synergy, in the efforts of government and communities, because now we're always maybe challenging each other. But the ideal is for the government and the communities to be working together harmoniously towards a common goal. Yeah, siguro ganun kasimple.
Simple pa yun, ah. Thank you, Arlene. No, thank you, ladies, for yes, Faye?
Oh, sorry. No, I was thinking if I could rephrase what I said, because I wanted to input the climate story. So,
Pwede ka humabol. Pwede.
Okay. So just to rephrase what I said earlier, my dream is for vulnerable communities to be no longer vulnerable, so that they and their future generations will live well and be safe from harm. And for decision makers and also the community to understand the science, which could, and these stories, these narratives can help help achieve that goal of understanding what they are at risk to, so that they can know what are the adaptation and resilience efforts that they need to do in order to address and reduce the risk for the future.
So,
Thank you.
Konting dagdag.
Sige,
Yeah,
go.
maybe when I say synergy between community and the government, maybe for the government plans to be reflective of the needs of their constituents, especially in responding to climate change.
Okay, Lesley might disappear soon, but thank you, ladies, for such a rich discussion. We covered a lot, but I think I would like to stress three things. The first is, when we talk about climate futures, we're not talking about a distant past, a distant future. We're talking about the future being here. It might not be in your area or community yet, but it might be according to the climate scenarios. And that's where climate scenarios play a part. It can guide us on what we must prepare for in the future. Second, there are many stories that we need to surface. Stories from within communities, stories from before the past, stories across communities. We can learn from other communities who've experienced extreme events. We can learn from the past. We can imagine the future so that we can avoid having the devastation of future extreme events. But all of these stories need to be tempered by understanding current and future risks. And I think lastly, there are many challenges and considerations to be able to prepare for our climate future. But if we all work together and apply our skills and capabilities in however way we can actually have a positive future despite increasing climate risks. It's a tall order. Simple lang daw, sabi ni Arlene, but there's really still a lot more work to do. But for now, we would like to thank our esteemed guests for the Kwentong Kinabukasan episode, Dr. Faye Cruz of the Manila Observatory, Architect Arlene Lusterio of Team DanTAOn, and Attorney Lesley Cordero of the World Bank. We will not be able to bridge climate knowledge to action on the ground without the support, experience, and insights of experts, storytellers, and advocates. We hope you will join Asia Society, Philippines, and the Oscar M. Lopez Center in our other episodes of ang ating Kwentong Klima toward raising awareness on climate change and enabling climate action for Filipino communities. Let's collaborate, let's communicate, let's build climate resilient communities. Thank you, and we hope to see you again soon.